Good morning again. I think people are still at the coffee break. Maybe we give them a minute to come back. No? Okay, I'm being instructed to go ahead. So I enjoyed my time this morning here, and I know Angela Stent will enjoy her time at the podium. Angela is a very well-known political scientist and historian, and Angela Stent and I go back at least, 200 years, something like that. We met during my time in Washington, D.C., when we had some interaction, as we are both interested in Russian politics, in American politics, and in the fate of the European continent. Angela Stent has written many books, particularly on Russian foreign policy and American-Russian relations, and she is the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian and East European Studies at Georgetown University. She has been teaching at Georgetown for a very long time. She was on the National Intelligence Council. She also worked at the Department of State's policy planning staff. She has therefore had a very successful career as combining being a practitioner, being experienced in the real world with academic and intellectual pursuits. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Angela today. She will enlighten us about Winston Churchill, the Soviet Union, and other affairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I thank the organizers for my invitation. This is my first time at the Churchill Society, and believe me, after I'm done with my talk, I will go and join up, and I look forward to, I've already benefited from some of the materials for this lecture. So you heard a very panoramic view from Klaus Laris about Churchill, about the Cold War, the antecedents to it. So I'm going to hone in on a sort of smaller piece of that, and that will be the relationship between Churchill and Stalin. And I would say the contradictions, let's say, between Churchill's own passionate anti-communism, which we saw clips of and you heard about, but his also, and again, Klaus talked about that, understanding that one needed to come to some kind of accommodation with the Soviet Union, however difficult it was, and however much Churchill himself, abhorred the idea of socialism. And so I'm going to focus really on the idea and the reality of Yalta and what it meant then and what it means now, and focusing again, as Klaus said, on the personal summit diplomacy. So in September 2015, Russian President Vladimir Putin, when he was addressing the United Nations General Assembly, declared, and I quote, "The Yalta system helped humanity through the turbulent, at times dramatic events of the last 7 decades. It saved the world from large-scale upheavals." Putin, in his drive to assert Russia on the world stage, has on several occasions repeatedly praised the Yalta Agreement and suggested the need for a similar condominium between the great powers to divide the world after the end of Pax Americana, which the Russians have already proclaimed. The United States' domination is over. They say we need a new world order, and this would be a tripartite Yalta between the United States, Russia, and China dividing the world. And this was discussed at a recent conference that I attended, the Yalta Conference, which I will say a little bit more about. So the Yalta Conference itself has resurfaced also in the debate about how the West should conduct its relations with a recalcitrant Russia, one that is at war with Ukraine and supports separatist troops in the Donbass region. So everything that you're hearing about now in the past few days about Ukraine in our own domestic system, who would have thought? But the debates about what should happen to Ukraine, how we should deal with it, a lot of this is also caught up in the questions of What should its relationship with Russia be, and does Russia have some kind of a veto right over Ukraine's future? Russia expresses concerns that it needs a sphere of privileged interests in the post-Soviet space, and that without that, it's vulnerable to future threats to its security, including from a country like Ukraine. Why does Russia need a buffer? And a buffer against what? And these are also issues that Churchill himself grappled with in his dealings, in his complicated dealings with Stalin. And really from his first fateful meeting with Stalin during World War II. So to emphasize how contemporary some of these historical questions are, let me remind you about the recent verbal battles between the Russian Foreign Ministry and the European Parliament on the question of how World War II began. Again, a very germane question for our conference today. The Russian Foreign Ministry, as some people have put it, has become the Ministry of Historical Revisionism. Its leader, Sergei Lavrov, the long-serving Russian foreign minister, has become one of the leading advocates of the current interpretation from Moscow about how World War II began. This September, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, the Russians flatly denied that the Soviet Union had, in accordance with the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they flatly denied that the Soviet Union had in fact invaded eastern Poland on September 17th and taken over those territories. And let me tell you how they put it. And you go on the Russian Foreign Ministry website, and you can read it in English there too. And this is what they said. On September 17th, says the Russian Foreign Ministry website, the Soviet troops entered territory that used to belong to Belarus and Ukraine and that had been occupied by Poland. So that's the latest version. And the European Parliament, and yesterday I happened to be sitting next to, I couldn't come here last night, I was at a dinner, I was sitting next to a Polish member of the European Parliament. I said, I want you to tell me about this resolution. And he indeed confirmed the fact that the European Parliament has now passed a resolution saying that World War II began because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union began the World War II, which is also an interesting interpretation of that. Now, this came up at this Yalta Conference 3 weeks ago in Sochi, where President Putin attends. This is an annual conference where we meet with President Putin and other Russian officials. Now, he said something interesting about Stalin. Usually Putin called Stalin an efficient manager. But this time, for the first time, he said that Stalin's repression and the camps and the deaths he caused were a very dark page in Russian history. And I think that's a first for Putin. But then Putin added, but to say that the Soviet Union started the war is outrageous. So, as we know, those of us that study Russia, in Russia, the past is always changing. So, whatever one's view of Yalta, it's undeniable, and now we do come back to Winston Churchill and what happened prior to Yalta and during the Yalta Conference. It's undeniable that Churchill was one of the architects of a system that recognized the post-war Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and ensured that the European Cold War never became hot. And I think that's another thing that we have to remember, that by agreeing to this territorial settlement in many ways, that was the cornerstone of ensuring that it didn't become hot. But Churchill did acknowledge that whatever might have been hoped, and whatever the urgent requirements of the wartime strategy, the result of this settlement was the imposition of repressive police states in Eastern Europe and of a communist system, which, as we all know, he abhorred. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the personal relationship between Churchill and Stalin. I gather that Yale is bringing out a book, alas, only next month, of Stalin's correspondence with both Churchill and Roosevelt, and I look forward to reading that, but I wasn't able to read that, obviously, in time for this talk. But looking into their bilateral, into their personal relationship. They distrusted each other, and we've already heard about that. They hated each other's systems, but they needed each other greatly during the war in order to defeat the Nazis. Churchill may have hoped that after the war, the West might be able to coexist with the USSR, and again, we've heard a lot about that. But unlike others, he did not have any illusions about the Soviet Union. And so after 1945, when there were other countries that were still committed to a sort of post-war version of the Grand Alliance, or hoping it would survive, Churchill was, I think, quite prescient in understanding just a mere year after the end of the war, that, and all the good feelings at Yalta, that in fact an Iron Curtain had descended on Europe. And we saw the clip. Of course, he grimly observed that the capitals and ancient states of Eastern Europe were now in the Soviet sphere. And I quote, "And all is subject on one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high degree of control from Moscow." I think something that neither he nor Roosevelt had maybe anticipated in 1945. And I also think Churchill, this was a very prescient phrase that he also uttered around the same time, and that really can apply today as well when we think about dealing with Russia. And he said, "The Soviets don't want war, but," quote, "what they desire is the fruits of war and the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines." And I think that he did understand very well, even at the same time as he was trying to, in the post-war era, as we've heard, deal with Russia. So, in preparing for my remarks today, I wanted to say that I've benefited very much from Andrew Roberts' magnificent biography of Churchill. I know we're going to hear from him later on today. And several things, of course, stand out. The strong anti-communist sentiments, the fact that he was a pragmatic and very talented wartime statesman, and he did understand how to deal with Stalin and to achieve results. And he understood that since the priority was winning the war, and that the Soviets were the key to defeating the Nazis, this, above all, I think, drove his interactions with Stalin. Now, just a few more quotes about how certainly Winston Churchill was not he understood the dangers of communism very well. In 1920, he told the House of Commons, "My hatred of Bolshevism arises from the bloody and devastating terrorism which they practice in every land into which they have broken, and by which alone their criminal regime can be maintained." Those are strong words. Later, he developed a good, and I would say a rather candid, working relationship with Ivan Maisky. And I want to say a few words now about Ivan Maisky, from whose diaries I have greatly benefited again in preparing for my talk today. So Ivan Maisky was the Soviet ambassador to London between 1932 and 1943. And he was really quite a remarkable man and a survivor. He was a Jew. He was originally a Menshevik, again, anti-Bolsheviks, and he managed somehow to survive all of Stalin's purges, not only through the 1930s and the war, until 1953, when he was arrested just 1 month before the Soviet dictator died. So this was really Moscow's key man in London, a very talented, a very erudite man, and he focused very much on developing good contacts with the British political elite, and he did develop good working relationships both with Churchill and with Eden. And it's wonderful to read in his diary some of the details about some of their conversations. He was also, again, a talented, a clever diplomat and a survivor in this era of high Stalinism, when people were to be arrested all the time. He only reported selectively to Stalin and the Kremlin the conversations he had with Churchill. Obviously, he wanted to report what he thought Stalin wanted to hear, and any ambassador would do that, but particularly if Stalin was your boss, you had to be extremely careful about that. The consequences of reporting things that he didn't want to hear would be a little more dire than in other countries. But I think we can also say when we read the diaries that, of course, Churchill also told Maisky things that he wanted Maisky to report back to the Kremlin, and Maisky only heard what he wanted to hear. So again, it's a complicated game, but the Churchill-Maisky connection was very important in terms of developing this relationship with the Soviet Union. Churchill realized, and this is now before his first meeting with Stalin, which I will come onto in a minute, that after the Nazi invasion, clearly, that the Soviets had borne the brunt of the fighting before the D-Day landings. They were the ones pushing back Hitler's army. And he also realized by 1945, since there were millions of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe, including Poland, there was a limit to what either the United Kingdom or the United States could do to alter the facts on the ground. His attitude, I would say Churchill's attitude towards Stalin fluctuated as well. Sometimes they got on well after they'd met, and sometimes they obviously didn't. How did Stalin view Churchill? This is an intriguing question. I was fortunate when I was writing my PhD at Harvard University to work with Adam Ulam, who's a great expert, wrote a very good biography of Stalin before, of course, we had all the documents that we now have. And I think he imagined that Stalin somehow secretly had an admiration for the British Empire. I'm not quite sure that that's true. I think that might have been more Ulam's own as a Polish refugee and emigre to the United States. He left on, I think, August the 30th, 1939. He just got out. That might have been his view. And maybe when we have these letters now from Stalin, we'll have a better idea. But Churchill to Stalin did represent, British imperialism. He was the key representation of British imperialism. And also, we do have one quote from Stalin here, and this is one to his Yugoslav comrade, Milovan Djilas, and he said, "Churchill is the kind of man who will pick your pocket for a kopeck if you don't watch him." Yes, pick your pocket for a kopeck. Roosevelt is not like that. He dips in his hand only for bigger coins. But Churchill will do it for a kopeck. So this was Stalin's view. But one also has to note, of course, that Stalin had little respect for the Labour Party, and he had actually disdain for Western European social democrats. He really didn't like them. As Attlee and Bevan found out after Churchill's electoral defeat during the Potsdam Conference, their alleged ideological proximity as socialists to Soviet communism did not assure them of warmer relations with Stalin than those of the imperialist Churchill. Churchill's view of the Soviet Union and of Bolshevism, of course, had been very strongly formed going back to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Obviously, before the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia, Britain, and France, of course, were allied together in World War I. And the problem with the Bolshevik takeover was not only that the communists overthrew and killed the royal family, which was obviously very shocking. And as you know, the last Russian Tsar bore an uncanny resemblance to British royalty, because of course they were all descended from different children that Queen Victoria had. So there were close blood links, if you like, between the Russian royal family, imperial royal family, and the British royal family. So it was not only the regicide and the overthrow of the royal family, but of course Russia's withdrawal from the war after the Bolsheviks took over, and leaving England and her allies to fight the Germans alone. And in a 1919 speech, Churchill claimed, and I quote here, "Every British and French soldier killed last year, i.e. 1918, was really done to death by Lenin and Trotsky." Churchill did support the British intervention in the Russian Civil War following in 1919. On the side of the whites. But when he then later on became Secretary for War, he agreed that Britain should withdraw its troops, so they were there sort of 1918 to 19, from northern Russia because they were unsuccessful. They could not defeat the Bolsheviks, and it was a failed intervention. And this is something, by the way, of course, that the Soviets remembered and Stalin remembered also. Britain, had tried to intervene in the Russian Civil War against the Bolsheviks. after the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, so we're now in the end of August 1939. And this goes back, I think, to something that Klaus said. Even then, although Churchill was shocked, one didn't know then, of course, what the secret protocols were. This only came out much later, i.e. the invasion of Eastern Poland. But even after that, he told Maisky that he hoped that the Soviet Union would reconsider having signed this pact with Nazi Germany. And in October 1939, he told Maisky that if Estonia and Latvia were to lose their sovereignty, he would, unquote, be very glad if it were to the Soviet and not the German sphere. So you see, right at the beginning, even before the Soviet Union and Britain were allied on the same side, there was an acknowledgement by Churchill that the Baltic states, if they fell under the Soviet sphere, so be it. This was, of course, also part of the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, as long as they didn't fall in the German sphere. Now, everything changed, of course, June 21st, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. Britain had tried to warn the Soviets about this. I mean, the British and the Americans had intelligence that this might happen. We know that the people around Stalin were worried about it, but Stalin had this blind spot for Hitler, which is subject of another whole discussion, and he didn't want to believe that Hitler would break this non-aggression pact and invade the Soviet Union. And so the minute that began, Churchill then said, "No one has been a more consistent opponent of communism than I have for the past 25 years. I will unsay no word that I have said about it." But then he said, "We have to join with Soviet Russia in this," and I quote, "the cause of any Russian fighting for his hearth and home is the cause of free men and free people in every quarter of the globe." So this total commitment then to supporting the Soviet Union in now that it had been invaded by Nazi Germany. And interestingly enough, and again we're coming on to the question of territorial settlements, Churchill told Maisky very early on, after June 1941, that Britain would recognize the 1941 borders of the Soviet Union, which included, the incorporation of Eastern Poland and the Baltic states and parts of Bessarabia into the Soviet Union, again, recognizing the legitimacy of the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And he told Maisky, this is in the diaries, "I've always understood and sought to justify the policy of limited expansion which Stalin has pursued in the last 2 years." It took nearly a year to finalize the Anglo-Soviet alliance, by which time, of course, the United States was already had entered the war. But, of course, right from the beginning, and this was, of course, a major bone of contention, difficulty between the Soviet Union on the one hand and Great Britain and the United States on the other, Stalin began to demand the opening of a second front in Europe to relieve the burden for the Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front. And so Churchill, I think, recognized that it was imperative that he meet Stalin face to face to establish a personal relationship that would underpin the alliance. And I agree very much with Klaus. For Churchill, this personal symmetry was very important. He took the lead, and as we heard from Klaus, he also wanted to be the first one to meet with Stalin, not Roosevelt. Despite Churchill's desire for an alliance with Stalin, however, there were limits to his tolerance of Soviet communism. And again, this comes out of Maisky's diaries. The BBC played the national anthems of all Allied countries on Sunday evening before the news. But at the time, when the Soviet Union and Britain were now allies, the national anthem of the Soviet Union was the Internationale, the battle hymn of the communist international movement, which of course was anathema to all non-communist Britons, and especially the guardian of the British Empire, Winston Churchill. So on the evening of the day in which the Anglo-Soviet alliance was finally signed, the BBC, as Maisky ruefully recalls in his diaries, they played a beautiful but little-known Soviet melody, not the Internationale. We're not sure whether this was on Churchill's direct order or not, but we can guess maybe. So, Churchill finally then got his way, and he did determined to visit Moscow. We've already heard he didn't like flying that much. Just remember, in those days, you were flying in unpressurized planes. It was a long way to go and not too much fun. Before Churchill went to Moscow, he had in fact suggested already in November 1941 that 2 senior British military leaders visit Moscow for consultations with their Soviet counterparts. Stalin's response was quite curt. He said if the British generals arrived with an agreement about opening a second front on the continent, that would be fine. Otherwise, it was a waste of time for Soviet generals to talk to them. So Maisky was very, very nervous about delivering this particular piece of news to Churchill, and it turned out he had good reason to be nervous about it. And I quote from Maisky's diaries, "The Prime Minister's face became purple. He clenched his fist." He spent some time begging Churchill, and he describes this very vividly in the diaries, to calm down. Nevertheless, Churchill persisted in his belief in the necessity of meeting Stalin, and so he did make the long journey via Cairo and Tehran to Moscow, and he arrived in August 1942. And Clementine Churchill described it as, quote, the visit to the ogre in his den. Churchill himself described his mission, and I quote, like carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole. Churchill wanted to deliver a message to Stalin that would not be well received. He realized he had to explain to Stalin that there would be no second front opened anytime soon. It wasn't possible. So he arrived in Moscow, and the very night that he arrived, he met Stalin in one of his villas, and Stalin had a number of nice villas in Moscow. He explained there would be no cross-channel invasion of France, 1942, and probably not for the foreseeable future. But Churchill gave Stalin the news there will be a landing in North Africa, and that could take some of the strain off the Russians by engaging the Germans in Africa. So Stalin initially, this first night, apparently appeared appeased. He inquired into the details of the proposed Allied landings, and Churchill thought everything was going swimmingly. Well, imagine his shock the next day when Stalin returned to the attack. He accused the British soldiers of cowardice and fear of the Germans, that they wouldn't confront them in Europe. And the succeeding discussions were very, very difficult. Churchill cabled Roosevelt and his own war cabinet to say that he had a most unpleasant discussion with Stalin, which sounds as if it was probably an understatement. And Stalin had, quote unquote, said a great many insulting things, and Churchill really contemplated leaving early. So this is the first personal summit, and he thought, maybe I'm just going to have to leave Moscow. Why did Stalin change his tune? Why was there this difference in approach? It turned out that the previous day, Stalin had met with the high command, and they'd focused on the desperate situation with the Germans because the Germans were beginning their assault surrounding the approaches to Stalingrad. So this is the height of the battle with the Germans over Stalingrad. And so I think one assumes that Stalin's outburst was partly the product of this frustration that there was no relief for the Soviet Union with the Second Front and this the ongoing situation in Stalingrad. Anyway, he and Churchill continued their conversations. They got over these initial tensions, and you won't be surprised to hear the atmosphere improved, and it culminated in a long and bibulous state dinner. And if you know anything about Stalin's dinners, you know, they started maybe 10 o'clock at night, they went maybe through 3 or 4 in the morning, huge quantities of food and, of course, of vodka. And you also won't be surprised to know that Churchill was one of the few people who was able to deal with this very well, unlike some of Stalin's other comrades who actually had to leave the dinners because they got ill from all the food and the drink. And so they concluded their 1942 visit, signing a statement saying that the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States would continue to fight Nazi Germany, and I quote, until the complete destruction of Hitlerism and any similar tyranny has been achieved. Churchill came back upbeat, saying that the Great Britain, that the Allies should support the Soviet Union with all possible means. So he really succeeded. I would say this was a great success for Churchill in 1942. He laid the basis for an alliance that would ultimately, of course, ensure Hitler's defeat. But the delay in opening the Second Front until June 1944 did remain a major issue of contention throughout the next couple of years. Now, we've had mention already of the Tehran Conference, so I just want to move now to the next time. This time, of course, Roosevelt was there, his first time meeting with Stalin. The big three were there. And it's there that Poland's fate was sealed. So if we're talking about territorial settlements, the issues that led up to the Yalta Conference, this was in fact sealed in November of 1943 at the Tehran Conference. It was Churchill himself who emerged as the advocate of moving Poland westward, of saying Poland is going to lose these territories that were Eastern Poland to the Soviet Union, but we're going to move Poland westward. Allowing the Soviet Union to keep those Polish territories that they'd occupied, and then, of course, ultimately expelling millions of Germans, ethnic Germans, from lands which previously had been German and were now to be Soviet, Polish, or Czech. So this is the beginning of this whole-scale territorial realignment after World War II, and then the expulsion of millions of Germans and everything, Poland moving westward. It's, I think, important to remember at Tehran that the Westerns, that Roosevelt and Churchill were still laboring on the defensive with their Soviet counterparts, because by this time the Soviet Union had pushed back the Germans in their war machine at a huge cost, millions and millions of deaths, and the Western armies were still mired down in Italy. And Stalin, I think, quite cleverly managed to, at this conference, as I say, have Churchill as the advocate of moving Poland's borders, the Curzon line in the eastern border, the Oder River as the western border. Now, the nature of the post-war domestic system in Poland was not discussed at Tehran. They only talked about what the borders afterwards. And then one other little footnote to this Tehran conference. So Stalin proposed to Churchill at Tehran, one might say tongue-in-cheek, that 50,000 German officers should be shot once victory was won to diminish German military might. Churchill knew who he was dealing with, so what Stalin didn't know was that Churchill had just received the secret information of the Soviet massacre of 22,000 Polish officers in the Katyn forest in 1940. And so Churchill actually did believe that Stalin would have been quite capable of shooting these 50,000 German soldiers had he been given the chance. So the next very important meeting between Churchill and Stalin, and again, very much part of this personal summitry, and probably the most controversial meeting between Churchill and Stalin, was in Moscow in 1944. Now, at this point, Churchill, I think, was increasingly concerned about Britain's post-war role in the world. We've heard allusions to that already. And so he decided to go back to Moscow and meet Stalin again without Roosevelt being there. And Stalin understood that Britain was also very concerned about its post-war presence in the Mediterranean. So in Moscow, Churchill arrives and he takes out a piece of paper, which he calls his naughty document, and he hands this piece of paper to Stalin. And on the document, he's divided Romania, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Hungary into percentages of Soviet and British influence, with Greece being predominantly British, Romania and Bulgaria being predominantly Russian, and the others divided 50-50. So it's just a piece of paper with the countries' names and percentages on it. Stalin perused it, and Churchill suggested that they burn the piece of paper. And Stalin said to Churchill, no, you keep it. And he did keep it, so you can see it. It's publicly available. Churchill, of course, was particularly concerned about the possibility of communists taking over in Greece, and he wanted sort of Stalin's agreement that this would not happen, that Stalin wouldn't back a communist takeover in Greece. And Stalin was concerned about retaining control over Bulgaria and Romania. Interestingly enough, Poland was not part of this quote-unquote naughty document, so Poland was already somehow put to one side. But by the end of the meeting, Churchill was very explicit in telling Stalin that they both had to use diplomatic terms in describing the agreement, because Churchill, of course, correctly noted that if they used the phrase dividing into spheres of influence, the Americans would be shocked. I would say that the 1944 meeting represented really the high point in this personal diplomacy between Churchill and Stalin. Churchill was amazed, really, because Stalin came to dinner at the British embassy in Moscow, which for Stalin was an absolutely unprecedented thing. You know, he had to take food tasters with him anyway to make sure that he survived dinners, but he went to the British embassy, and then he even went to the airport the next day in the pouring rain to see the delegation off. And he took Churchill to the Bolshoi Ballet, and while at the Bolshoi Ballet, Churchill received a 15-minute standing ovation when the spectators in the Bolshoi realized that Winston Churchill was watching the ballet. So this really was, in a way, a high point. And of course, then the next time they met, and now we'd finally come to the Yalta Conference in 1945, was at Yalta. As you all know, President Roosevelt by this time was really quite ill, and he didn't survive Yalta, only by a few weeks, but he was there. It was the last meeting of the Big Three. Churchill called Yalta the Riviera of Hades. Wonderful term of phrase. The palace housing the British delegation had plenty of bugs, of both the bed and electronic kind, of course. Its plumbing, shall we say, left something to be desired, or much to be desired. Some people have depicted the Yalta Conference as kind of these two naive American and British leaders who were manipulated and outmaneuvered by a wily Soviet leader who knew exactly what he wanted, and he got what he wanted, and that, of course, they betrayed Eastern Europe. The reality was, of course, in February 1945, there were millions of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe, including in every region of Poland. And the Western allies wanted Moscow to abandon its neutrality pact with Japan. There had been this Soviet-Japanese neutrality pact during the war, and they wanted the Soviet Union to enter the war in the Pacific too, and declare war on Japan. Did Churchill really believe, and Roosevelt, did they really believe that Stalin would allow free elections in Poland? They had persuaded Stalin to sign on to this Declaration of Liberated Europe, which promised, and I quote, the right of all peoples to choose the form of government in which they will live. The issue is that the West didn't have much of a choice at this time. I think you can say that both Churchill and Roosevelt hoped that Stalin would stick to his word, that there would be free and fair elections in Poland and other East European countries, but their leverage was limited. Churchill, of course, noted later on, our hopeful assumption was soon to be falsified, and already in October of 1945, speaking to Prime Minister Mackenzie King of Canada, Churchill argued, quote, that Russia was grabbing one country after another, one capital after another. They should have been stood up to more than they were. So he was making the argument that somehow we should have stood up more to the Soviet Union. And then, of course, 4 months later, and we've already heard from Klaus and watched clips from the famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, talking about the Iron Curtain. Moreover, in February 1953, when Stalin's final terror, the anti-Semitic doctor's plot, was being unleashed, Ivan Maisky, right, Churchill's longtime interlocutor, dinner guest, they spent many, many, many hours together. Maisky was arrested in Moscow in February of 1953 and accused of high treason. He was tortured, and under torture he confessed that Winston Churchill had recruited him as a spy, hoping that this confession would save him from prison, which of course it didn't. And he spent the last years of his life in prison. Maisky, he was only released a few years later. So that was the ending, rather sad ending of that story. But, and we've already heard about this from Klaus, after Stalin's death in 1953, Churchill urged his colleagues, as we've heard, to seek an opening to the new Soviet government, post-Stalin government, to discuss issues such as arms control. Again, I won't belabor this because we've already heard about it, but he was very concerned about the potential for nuclear war, and he thought it was imperative, despite all of these problems, to reach out to the new Soviet leadership. And as we've heard again, until his death, Winston Churchill believed that it was very important to seek better relations with the Soviets in an age of nuclear weapons. So let me just make a couple of concluding remarks. For many East Europeans, especially Poles and citizens of the Baltic state, they will still view today what happened at Yalta as a betrayal of the people of Central and Eastern Europe by Churchill and Roosevelt. It consigned them to Soviet domination for 44 years. When the East Europeans rebelled, and we saw a picture of the East German uprising in 1953, the uprising in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and all of those times, the West stood by. Despite its rhetorical support for freedom and for anti-communist movement, but it stood by, it did nothing to stop their repression by Soviet and Warsaw Pact troops. So the Yalta system indeed kept the peace in Europe, but of course it perpetuated brutal Soviet control over these countries. When communism collapsed in 1989, the Yalta system disappeared. Countries that had been in the Warsaw Pact, they all eventually joined NATO. Then after the disintegration of the USSR in December of 1991, Russia had to deal with 14 new states that had emerged out of the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, as we know, we had a new Euro-Atlantic security architecture that emerged, but one in which Russia had no stake. It is not part of that Euro-Atlantic security structure. And then, of course, you had the annexation of Crimea in 2014. You had the launch of a war by Russia in southeastern Ukraine, and the Russian insistence that Russia has a right to a sphere of privileged interests in the post-Soviet space. Russia considers any possible expansion of NATO or the European Union to any of the post-Soviet states, of course, and primarily including Ukraine, as a threat to its security. It defines its security perimeter not as the borders of the Russian Federation, but as the borders of the post-Soviet space. And so the argument goes on, and these are similar arguments that were there when Stalin was meeting with Churchill. Does Russia have legitimate security interests in its neighborhood, which the West has to respect, given, and in this case now, if we're talking about Ukraine, that Russia is Ukraine's neighbor? It cares much more about what happens in Ukraine than other countries do, either the Europeans or the United States. Should the West continue to insist on the right of countries like Ukraine and other post-Soviet states to choose their own alignments, or should they respect the fact that Russia claims that it has legitimate security concerns about that? Churchill, I think, had to deal with these realities on the ground. They informed his pragmatic decisions in the midst, of course, of a total war. But he also did understand that at some point one had to push back. I have a new book, which I will be signing, I guess, between 4:15 and 5, called Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. I discuss some of these related issues there. Putin's Russia has, of course, with very limited resources, succeeded in returning to the world stage as a major power. It's reappeared in the parts of the world from which it withdrew after 1991. Look at the Middle East, look at Syria, look at the burgeoning partnership with China. Putin, of course, has played a weak hand very well. I think a combination of his training as a KGB case officer and his training as a judo champion, a master of judo for which he won many awards as a young man. And I think his uncanny ability to benefit from opportunities presented to him by a divided and distracted West. But he does indeed seek a new world order. He talks about it, a tripartite Yalta for the 21st century. So is in fact a new world order divided into spheres of influence between Russia, China, and the United States. Is that in fact possible? Is this just a fantasy? And I would just conclude by saying that as we look into an increasingly murky international future in the current situation that we find in ourselves today, I think it's very important, as this conference shows, to understand what real statesmanship looks like. Thank you.